Gwe, hello. Epchalasi, welcome to Treaty Rights 101. Before we get into today, I first want to share that the background photos within this document are captured by my mother during a summer sunset in Unama'ki, Cape Breton Island. If you ever get a chance to travel to the East Coast, I definitely recommend going near the end of August or into September, as you will get a chance to experience some of the most beautiful sunsets. And it's also during one of the most beautiful times of the year as the seasons change into autumn. So I'd like to start off with sharing about myself, who I am, where I come from, and the land I'm situated on today. Nin Deloisi Shaya MacDonald, Nin na Ulnu, Daglealwe Pauna Ponji Dahamcook, Ach Unamagi Mi'kma'ki Wedgie Toronto. My name is Shaya MacDonald. I have both Mi'kmaq and French ancestry. I am Eagle Clan, Two-Spirit. My gender is non-binary, and my pronouns are they and them, theirs. My Mi'kmaq family comes from the southwest part of Newfoundland, along the coast of Port-au-Port and St. George's Bay. I was born and raised in Unama'ki, Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki territory. And today I'm currently living in Treaty 13 in Toronto, or Toronto, Ontario. Mi'kma'ki is the land originally inhabited by my peoples, where my ancestors lived, thrived, and survived. And I am a guest on this land that I am situated on today. I am also not one singular thing, as I am many things and have many responsibilities. I am a dreamer, I'm an artist, I'm a crafter, I am a drummer, I'm a partner, a sibling, an auntie, a child. I'm a social worker and a helper and supporter to my family and community. I also work as an external consultant for the YWCA Canada, primarily supporting the Truth and Reconciliation Action Committee. And I'm also a student studying at Trent University and the Channing Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies. It's also important for me to share a land acknowledgement, but also share why I do this. As a guest on this land, it is important for me that I recognize the sacred land on which I am living and working on. Toronto is the home to a very large Indigenous population, including intergenerational family members who have been impacted by the history, the legacy, and the ongoing impacts of colonialism, cultural genocide, as well as political and environmental violence and injustice. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between nation to nation, and with the arrival of settlers, the treaty is extended to those who come to this land, meaning if you have taken land to live on, in this area, you have therefore become one with this treaty and have a responsibility, as treaties are about responsibilities. The land has been cared for, or this land has been cared for and protected by the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. And it is now home to many, many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Metis. I seek to live in respect, in peace, and friendship and right relations with these nations as I live and work upon their traditional territory. As Ulnu, my identity and indigeneity are tied directly to land, and this is why it is important for me to share who I am and where I come from. Land acknowledgements recognize our long-standing history and our role both historically and currently. It is important to remember that colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to continuously recognize our role in colonialism and capitalism and all the things that keep it upheld. We are all treaty people, and as such, we are all accountable for this violence that Indigenous peoples face. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements have for some time turned into a performative act of allyship. It is important that we move away from performative allyship and into real action. It's important to bring attention, awareness, and real change and real discussion on who has control and makes decisions about this land. Let that sink in. So I ask you, who has control and makes decisions about this land? This land was not conquered, nor won in a war. It was stolen, and you are living on stolen land. And real change starts when we all decide to let go and start working to undo the ongoing colonialism that we all continue to benefit from. It is also important for me to share with you that ownership of land is not physical. Ownership is an ideology or concept that stems from colonialism and capitalism. No one can have ownership over land, water, air, or anything that subsequently is produced through or sustained by land, water, air. That land is meant to be shared, never owned and never exploited. Ownership of land is a spiritual and historical responsibility. My intentions in sharing this land acknowledgement is to bring awareness and attention to Indigenous peoples having full autonomy and caring for the land, and to be making the final decisions about the land. So I also want to share a very small snapshot of my family and the people that I come from as well. And also probably the only professional photo or nice photo that you'll ever find of me. This is a photo of me in the center taking during graduation ceremony in 2018. And in the other photos, you see me with several of my siblings and both my parents as well. And here is the land that I come from, or at least a colonial map of that land, right? Which I call, and many people call, Mi'kma'ki. There are 8 districts within Mi'kma'ki, starting from the east and going to the west. So in the top right corner of this green map here, we have Dahamkok, which you can only see on the right corner of that one map. Dahamkok is the land across the water, known now as Newfoundland. And then we have Unama'ki right here, which is where I grew up. This is known as the Land of the Fog, which is now known as Cape Breton Island. Just west, we have Abiktuk, which is called the Explosive Place, which is now known as Pictou. Next, we have Eskigay-Wagik, which is the Skin Dresser's Land, which is now known as the land between Sheet Harbor to Canso. Then we have Sebeganagidik, known as the land where wild potatoes and wild turnips grow, and what is now known as Shubenacadie. And just southwest of here, we have Gesbokwig, which is where the land ends, which is now known as southwestern or southwestern Nova Scotia and Yarmouth area. Northwest of here, we have Saguenayuk, which is where the land drains, which is now known as Miramichi or Bay of Fundy. And just further northwest, there is Gaspé, which is the last land, and it's now known as New Brunswick, or as well as Gaspé within Quebec. And across the waters, we have Egbegwick, which is the land lying in the water, which is now known as Prince Edward Island. So Unama'ki here is where the Smile Island that I grew up on, and Ahamcook is where my Mi'kmaq ancestry, just specifically this area here, the southwest part, peninsula, Georges Bay area. And then lastly, I wanted to also share some photos of the forests, the trees, the waters that I was raised in. My virtual background is also a capture of the Milky Way that you can see during some of the darkest nights and the clearer skies within Ugamagi. And then lastly, before we get into today's agenda, I'd like to share one last thing, which is a piece of art I created back in 2018 for York University. And this piece of art is titled Finding Our Roots. Finding Our Roots tells a story of uncovering what was once known. Under a city, under a landscape, there are stories, histories just beneath our feet. It also highlights the importance of looking within ourselves to see what is buried. You have truth, you have wisdom, you have stories that are hidden. Look for your stories and uncover them. In the art piece, you will notice a colonial settler society occupied on sacred lands. This space comes with challenges of finding our roots and being in ceremony while dwelling in colonized spaces on dish with one spoon territory. Edawaptamuk, or two-eyed seeing, will guide us. At the center, you will notice a heart located at the end of the root system. And when we have found our roots and uncovered what has been buried, you will also uncover love, connection, and strength. So for today's webinar, we will be looking at definitions of what it means to be, what it means to respect the truth about treaties. We will also be doing a small activity on your own about positioning yourself within your own worldviews. We'll be going through the common myths and facts, and then we'll be discussing treaty education, treaty relationships, and treaty responsibilities. So let's explore definitions. Now that I shared a bit about who I am and where I come from, let's explore some definitions before we hop into talking about treaties. So you might be asking yourself, why does terminology matter? So the history of relationships between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples is complex and has been paternalistic and damaging. As a result, terminology can represent something more than just a word. It can represent certain colonial histories and power dynamics. On the other hand, terms can empower populations when the people have the power to self-identify. It is important to recognize that the potential these words may hold, but it's also important and very possible to understand these terms well enough to feel confident in using them and in creating dialogue. These terms can be confusing, and many of us often lump them all together and use them whenever referring to a person who is Indigenous. First off, when we talk about the First Peoples of this land, we are referring to more than one group. In Canada specifically, there are 3 distinct groups of Indigenous peoples: First Nations, Inuit, and Metis. Each group has its own distinct language or languages, culture, beliefs. There are also vast differences in practices between each nation, and an Indigenous worldview or perspective is a connection between many nations, but know that there is no collective group of defined or static Indigenous worldview that all Indigenous people embody. When we look at terminology, it can also be controversial, whether someone is using it unintentionally or to intentionally disrupt colonial ideas. Whether words like Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nation, Inuit, and or Metis, whether it's specific nations like Mi'kmaq, or Indian status or non-status. These are all words we hear frequently, so let's break them down. So first we have the word Aboriginal Peoples. Now, if I was here in person, I'd be asking folks to explain what this means, but in this event, you can always pause between these parts and have a discussion before moving to the next slide where I chat about what these words means as well. Aboriginal is a term that has gained currency in the 1990s. It is embedded in Section 35 of Canada Constitution and Section 25 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Aboriginal is still an appropriate term. However, it is being replaced by Indigenous, a choice often made by Indigenous peoples themselves, as there is a growing preference for the term Indigenous peoples rather than Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal is always an adjective, never a noun, such as an Aboriginal person or Aboriginal peoples, and it's always capitalized. Therefore, you should never, ever, ever use the term as a standalone, meaning the Aboriginal or Aboriginals. More importantly, it is incorrect when you say Canada's Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal peoples do not belong to Canada. Aboriginal peoples are the original peoples of this land, and in fact, many Aboriginal peoples reject Canadian identity. Aboriginal peoples is a collective name for all of the original peoples of what is now known as Canada, as well as their descendants. Therefore, it should not be used to describe only one or two of the nations. The Constitution Act of 1982 specifies that the Aboriginal peoples in Canada consist of three groups: First Nation, Inuit, and Metis. Also, side note, some people also believe Aboriginal refers to ab, meaning from, and origin, meaning beginning, so from the beginning, while other folks believe that it refers to not Aboriginal in the sense that ab in normal means abnormal or not normal, right? So at the end of the day, it's always best practice to just ask another human what they prefer to be called. And a person will tell you, right? So whether it's about their identity, their nation, person's name, their pronouns, right? We're all humans, so just ask, have a conversation. Next, we have Indigenous peoples. Indigenous is a term gaining currency, as I said before, and replacing Aboriginal. It is used in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The term Indigenous peoples is used to refer to First Nation, Métis, Inuit collectively in what is now known as Canada, and also to refer to Indigenous peoples worldwide collectively. In some contexts, specific language adds useful clarity, as in the Indigenous peoples in what is now known as Canada, or Indigenous peoples around the world. Indigenous is always an adjective and it is always capitalized, meaning an Indigenous person is an individual who identifies as First Nation, Inuit, and or Métis. Indigenous peoples as the distinction are the distinct societies of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in what is now known as Canada. The term recognizes the cultural integrity and diversity of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous people is a single one of the distinct societies of First Nation, Métis, or Inuit in what is now known as Canada. In this example, Inuit is an Indigenous people. So are the Mi'kmaq, so are the Haudenosaunee, so are the Anishinaabe. Also, Indigenous as a word means native or original to the area of land. And for me, when I use the word Indigenous peoples while on Turtle Island, I'm referring to First Nation, Inuit, and or Métis. Next, we have Indigenous Right. So Indigenous right is a term that describes an inherent and original right possessed collectively by Indigenous peoples, and in some cases by individual Indigenous people. Some Indigenous rights have legal recognition in Canada, and some do not. So the term can assert a moral and ethical imperative. For example, hunting and fishing is a collective Indigenous right. Indigenous peoples in Canada have this right. It is also Indigenous right of individual Indigenous hunters and fishers. This right has some recognition in law. For example, the Supreme Court decision R versus Powley in 2003 recognized hunting and fishing as an Aboriginal right within Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982. That includes the Metis. However, some jurisdictions, notably Alberta, contest the legal basis of Métis hunting and fishing. Also, ownership and control of Indigenous cultural property is another example of an Indigenous right, but a right only exercised collectively and without so far legal recognition in Canada. Next, we have the word Native. So Native is a word similar in meaning to Aboriginal. Native peoples is a collective term to describe the descendants of the original people of North America. The term is increasingly seen as outdated, particularly when used as a noun, as this is incorrect and is losing acceptance. Next, we have First Nations. So this term was originally coined by Indigenous peoples in about the late 1970s, partially or partly as an alternative to inappropriate terms such as Native or Indian, which were in common uses at the time. It was adopted by the national political organization, the Assembly of First Nations, previously the National Indian Brotherhood, in the early 1980s. And in the 1990s, the term gradually became adopted by the general population in Canada. The term has strong political connotations. It refers to separate nations that occupied territory before the arrival of Europeans. The term also has a double meaning in that it is sometimes used to describe a reserve or a group within a larger nation. So First Nations refers to a segment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. To use it in a context that describes all Indigenous peoples in Canada, you would need to say First Nations, Inuit, and or Métis. Or depending on the meaning, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. In this context, critiques of the term, such as Métis leader Howard Adams, have pointed out that the word first can be interpreted as elitist. It is also worth noting that First Nations is not used in reference to Indigenous peoples in the United States. In fact, it is sometimes used to distinguish between Indigenous peoples on either side of the border. First Nations is an adjective, meaning a First Nations person is an individual who comes from a First Nation. You can also say, she is First Nations. First Nations people are people who come from First Nations. It can also be a noun, which can be plural or singular. For example, the First Nations of the prairies are all of the First Nations that live on the prairies. You can also talk about a First Nation in particular, such as Buffalo Point First Nation, etc. Next, we have status Indian or non-status Indian. This term, I have one more slide. So this term describes the status of individual people under the Indian Act. So do not forget that piece. This is an appropriate term in this particular context and is accepted by Indigenous people as describing this context. Because of the problematic nature of Indian in general, however, it is best to clarify that you mean status Indian under the Indian Act. Note that the Indian Act is a controversial, racist, and oppressive piece of legislation, often under discussion among Indigenous peoples. It may therefore undergo changes that will alter the context for terminology in the future. Both are legal terms, referring to an individual status as being registered, or for whatever reason is not registered with the federal government. Next, we have the word Métis. This term has many contexts in Canada. People who self-identify as Métis do so for different reasons. In one of its meanings, Métis describes an Indigenous people who emerged during the fur trade from the intermarriage of people of European descent and people of Indigenous descent. These people were at the center of the Red River Resistance of 1869-70 and the Riel Resistance of 1885. The term the Métis, a collective noun with the definite article, can be taken to refer exclusively to this group. Some commentators refer to them as the historic Métis. The Métis who lived at Red River at this time of the Red River Resistance were both French-speaking and English-speaking, a result of the involvement of France in the fur trade through Montreal and of England in the fur trade through Hudson Bay. Métis, of course, is a French term that means mixed. The English-speaking Métis at Red River Resistance, or Red River, sometimes refer to themselves as half-breeds, which is a term that has fallen out of use. In another of its meanings as well, Métis with Othi accent is a way English-speaking people of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestry might refer to themselves, including those of Red River heritage and those of other heritages. Generally though, Métis with the accent in place is currently used as an umbrella term, even in contexts where other words from the French language are rendered without accents. Métis also refers to people who identify as having mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous heritage and who do not descend from the Métis of Red River. The term Métis peoples, lowercase and plural peoples, recognizes the complex of possible identities and can be used as an ambiguous umbrella term to encompass everyone of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous heritage, including people of Red River heritage and others. As a substitute for the term Indigenous peoples, the phrase First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis often imply a focus on the Métis of Red River heritage in the final term. The phrase First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples indicate a broad focus on all people of mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous heritage in the final term. As a noun, however, Métis can be plural or singular. So for an example, he is Métis, or Alberta is the only province in Canada that has designated land for the Métis. Métis is also an adjective meaning Métis heritage or a Métis person. Next we have Inuit or Inuk. So Inuit is a term for the Indigenous people who have traditionally inhabited the Arctic regions and northern parts of what is now known as Canada, Greenland, and Siberia. Inuit can be an adjective or in an Inuit agreement. So what do I have here? Inuit agreement or an Inuit musician. Inuit is also a collective noun. It means the people, so it does not take an article or the qualifier people. For example, you can say Inuit are traditional hunters of the whale. So the following would be considered incorrect. The Inuit are traditional hunters of the whale, or the Inuit people are traditional hunters of the whale. Inuk is a singular noun for an individual. It is only a noun and does not take an indefinite article like a or an. For example, you can say, this musician is Inuk, or he is Inuk. The following are incorrect. The musician is an Inuk, the musician is Inuit, or he is an Inuk musician. Next, we have treaty right. So this term describes a right held by Indigenous peoples collectively and by individual Indigenous people because of treaties Indigenous peoples negotiated with Canada's government. Example of treaty rights in Canada include provisions of reserves, provisions of education, provisions of healthcare. Healthcare was originally negotiated under Treaty 6 and later extended to all First Nations covered by treaty. And lastly, I've included a list of inappropriate and offensive terms. I will not be speaking these out loud as they are very offensive, and I strongly encourage everyone here listening to pause here to review and to learn to undo these words from your language, speaking and writing. Also, a fantastic resource to check out is a book called Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples by Gregory Younging. I've included this source in the bottom left of the screen for folks to check out, or pause now and take that as a note as well. Okay, so who are treaty people? If you're a treaty person, please raise your hand, stand up, identify yourself. Is that it? Should I keep waiting? So we are all treaty people. This is a photo from the Six Nations Walk of Peace, Friendship, and Respect, captured by Kevin Conyu in April 2012. Today, we're going to learn about how we are all treaty people through learning about reconciling the truth about treaties, treaty rights and Indigenous rights, and most importantly, treaty education, treaty relationships, and treaty responsibilities. So we have the meaning of treaties. So when we look at reconciling the truth about treaties, there are a few important things that we need to understand. For Indigenous peoples, treaties are seen as sacred and binding, and often were accompanied by ceremony, such as pipe ceremony, or exchange of symbolic gifts, or the creation of wampum belts. Whereas for non-Indigenous people, treaties were understood as a self-serving deal rather than a sacred pact between independent nations. Historically, non-Indigenous people treaty negotiators believed treaties were inexpensive and convenient ways to strip Indigenous title from most of the lands in what is now known as Canada, so that land and resources could be used and exploited by settlers. In modern times, federal and provincial governments tend to interpret treaties in legalistic terms, contending that Indigenous peoples ceded, surrendered, and yield their ancestral rights, titles, and land through treaties. However, Indigenous title has neither been surrendered nor acquired by the Crown. We never surrendered this land, therefore it is unceded. This narrowing view of treaties has produced a huge divide between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. In one hand, we have government view of treaties as a legal instrument, right? That's surrendered Indigenous rights and land rights. Whereas on the other hand, we have an Indigenous view of treaties and instruments of relationships between autonomous people who agree to share the land and resources and act with peace and friendship. Remember, ownership is a capitalistic and colonial concept. The idea that land, water, food can be owned is as silly as bottling up air and selling it to you. We cannot own the air, and sell it to make profit, just as we shouldn't be exploiting the land and water to sell it to make profit. For Indigenous peoples, treaties do not surrender rights, rather, they confirm Indigenous rights. It's also important to understand language. During the signed number treaties between 1871 and 1921, Indigenous peoples were given translators by the Europeans who were to translate what was being said during the discussions. The use of specific wording during the negotiations and within the treaties are also points of contention. What can be seen here is a significant difference between the written documents used by government officials of the time and the oral translations used by Indigenous communities throughout the negotiation process. So when we look at Indigenous worldview and compare them to Western or capitalistic worldviews we have today, we see that Indigenous worldviews support the traditional ways of how we come to know, be, and do. In other words, how we come to learn, exist, practice, live, grow, heal, all these things and so much more. It is about how we come to know things, such as through listening, sensing, viewing, reading, sharing. How we come to be things, such as how we establish relations among entities and protect all living things through sharing and protecting animals, land, nature, water, everything on Mother Earth. And how we come to do things, such as how we maintain these relations through language, art, tradition, ceremony, land practices, social organizing. These systems that support Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and the beliefs and values held differ greatly compared to capitalistic Western worldviews. For me, I navigate the world with humility, with bravery, with honesty, wisdom, truth, respect, and with love. Through treaty negotiators, we agree to peace, friendship, and sharing and protecting the land and resources. We all made this agreement, and Indigenous peoples expected that settlers would uphold their responsibilities to share the land and protect the land for all of us and our generations to come, both yours and mine. So I've also included a quick activity, and once we finish sharing these varying perspectives on this slide, I encourage you to pause before moving to the next slide. I encourage you to reflect on the spectrums between what I am about to share. Grab a piece of paper, a pen, a pencil, and identify where you fall on these spectrums based on your positionality, your social location, who you are and where you come from, and the values and beliefs and ethics and worldviews that you embody and uphold. Once you're done, I encourage you to also share this with others who you are sitting by, right? Hopefully you're doing this as a group and you can share those results, your thoughts, your critical reflections, as learning and growing is done through relationships, through sharing. Okay, so I first want to preference that these worldviews that I'm about to discuss are only some of the similarities between many nations, but do not speak for all nations or all Indigenous peoples. As Indigenous peoples, we are extremely diverse in our languages, cultures, practices, ways of life, and worldviews. And this is only a small summary of some of the similarities among some nations, but not all nations and not all peoples. These are also worldviews. They are spectrums, and you can fall anywhere on the spectrum. And just because you are not Indigenous does not mean that you do not share similarities with Indigenous worldviews. It is very important that we all practice critical reflexivity and evaluate our worldviews and even our positionality. So starting with the top left, it says interconnectedness, which speaks to a spiritually oriented society and a system based on beliefs in spiritual world, and that we are all related and connected. And on the other end of the spectrum, there is an emphasis on separation of nature and humans, where society is built on scientific skepticism, requiring proof as a basis of belief. And if they don't have proof, then it doesn't exist, right? It's not real. We have collectivism and consensus-based, meaning there is a focus on quality of your relationship, and then individual and competitiveness, where there is a focus on achieving individual goals for individual wealth. We have holistic and interdependent, right? A society operating in a state of relatedness. Everything and everyone is related, and the belief that people, objects, and the environment as a whole are all related and connected. When I say Misit Nogama, all my relations, it is me giving gratitude to the reciprocal relationships and responsibilities I hold with all humans, animals, and non-humans and non-animals. Whereas on the other end, there is a focus on egoistic independence, meaning humans are seen as the most important in the world, and identity stems from the jobs and the material possessions that one holds. For Indigenous worldviews, there is an emphasis on extended family, with the focus on community as caregivers. Children are not owned, and all humans are autonomous humans who have full consent over their entire spirit, their entire being, and their bodies. And then we have the nuclear family, right? That focuses on the parents, the child, and maybe the grandparents too. But there is this view that children are expected to adjust their behavior to parents, and that children are the responsibility of the immediate parents only. In fact, they are seen as being owned by the parents, and children do not have consent or autonomy or ownership over their bodies or their being. And then we have respect for children and elders. Children and elders are people who have a sophisticated awareness of the world and relationships and the connections between families, and they hold profound knowledge and a specific outlook on the world that is highly, highly valuable. They are teachers, and they are both closest to the spirit world due to their age. And then the other end, we have youth-orientated view, meaning that respect is prioritized for youth appearance and feeds into a perpetual cycle of ageism where there is disrespect for older people and children. And then we have oral history tradition, referring to traditional knowledge passed down through generations, embedded with a culture, language, and way of life, and embodies a wealth of wisdom and experience of nature gained over millennia from direct observations and relationships with the land. Whereas at the other end, there is an emphasis on written word as history, reinforcing that knowledge is only valid or only true when it is compared to what has already been proven and or how it appears within a textbook. A constant state of comparing new knowledge to old knowledge, right? Things that already exist. And it only becomes valid or true if it is in line with that old knowledge or what's already in a textbook. And then we have generocracy or matrilineal, based on kinship with the mother or the female line, versus paternalistic or patriarchal, based on a system with men holding primary power. Paternalistic means, holding power over freedom and responsibility. Then we have pluralistic, diverse spiritual life, based on nature as living and sacred and fully saturated with spirit, versus a religious life based on tradition as non-spiritual and materialistic. Also, for Indigenous worldviews, there can be many, many truths. There are multiple truths, as truths are dependent upon one's individual experiences. Whereas in Western capitalistic worldview, there is only one truth based on science or Western style law. When we look at relationality, right, there's a 4-quadrant circle, intuitive, non-time orientated, fluid, circular worldview. Time is measured in cyclical events, and the seasons are central to the cyclical concept, with an emphasis on timelessness, right? And if you're first hearing the word timelessness, think about what it means to have timelessness and to value no non-time. And then the opposite end, we have linear, based on logical, time-orientated, systematic, cause and effect core in the framework of months, years, days, hours, reinforce this linear structure. We also have the view of land and how land is also important. Indigenous worldviews view the land as being sacred and a gift for which we should have gratitude for and reciprocity with. Whereas the land through the Western capitalistic view is seen as a resource that should be available for development and extraction and for the benefit of humans. But not all humans, right? Only those who hold the most power will benefit the most from this exploitation. And then lastly, we have community-based healing. Communal ceremonies is done in relation to others, in connection, in relationship, and ceremony, and reciprocity. Whereas on the other end, we have total institution, whether it's mental health hospitals, residential facilities, military boot camps, convents, a focus on places where the primary characteristic of a total institution is that people carry out all of their activities in the exact same way as others, in the same places, and in the immediate company of the same group of other people. Please feel free to pause now and take 15 minutes to engage in this activity and share with others when you're done, so you can, as a group, learn together through connection. And when you're done, come back to part 2 on Treaty Rights 101, where we will be picking up on slide 34.